Hello, Infelsha. This is David McDonnell, host of Random Thoughts from County Antrim. Today's September the 6th, the umpteenth month of this pandemic. And I'm going to give you what I always do, some of my random thoughts together with some historical tidbits, some stories, some yarns, and whatever else pops into my mind. Now, last week I talked to you about the dirt in the little village of Bow in County Antrim in Ireland. And if you didn't watch that one, I recommend you go back. Go to my website, clandonald.net. Look for the icon on the homepage for the podcast. Click the podcast and take a look at that podcast. Because I talked about the miraculous dirt in the little village of Bow. Now, when I finished that podcast, I had a couple more things I wanted to say, although I ran out of time, so I thought I'd start out today with filling in the blanks, so to speak. And that story last week was about the miracle of the dirt in Bow, and the miraculous cures that could arise by putting the dirt on an ailment or a wound. So I want to talk to you about miracles in general. What is a miracle? Where do they come from? So I want to tell you about a Presbyterian minister in Ireland who gave a sermon on miracles. And if you've ever been to a Presbyterian service, you know there are three parts to a Presbyterian sermon. The first part is the minister tells you what it is he's going to tell you. And the second part is the minister telling you what it is he wanted to tell you. And the third part is when the minister is wrapping things up and he tells you what it is he just told you. And they must learn that in Presbyterian schools, because every Presbyterian service has all three parts. And this minister was giving a sermon on miracles. And in the first part of the sermon, he talked about what he was going to tell you about miracles. And in the second part of the sermon, he told the congregation about miracles. And in the third part of the sermon, he told the audience, his congregation, what it is he just told them about miracles. And he figured with that approach to telling the sermon, his congregation would have a pretty good idea of what a miracle was. So when he finished, he did the closing prayer. Congregation began to sing a hymn. He left the pulpit, walked down the aisle between the pews to the front door of the church, so that he was the first one out the door. His plan was to greet people as they left the congregation after the closing hymn. And there was, in fact, a long line, a long procession of people leaving the congregation to go out the front door, say goodbye, thank him for the sermon, perhaps receive a compliment in return, and then leave. But the line was quite long. In fact, you know, when I wasn't raised a Presbyterian, but when I was a child at a Baptist church, we did the same tradition, and there was a long line, interminable line, to get out of the church at the end of the sermon. And my father hated waiting in line, and more important than that, he was quite anxious to get home. So while everyone else was waiting in line to go out the front door, he would take us and we'd sneak out the back door. And it wasn't just because he didn't like waiting in line. He was anxious to get home to watch the football game. There was a football game on every Sunday afternoon, shortly after we got out of church. And in those days, there was, before cable and before satellite and whatever, there was only one game on television on a Sunday afternoon. So if you missed the game, you couldn't watch football for another week. So we always snuck out the back door. But in this church, Presbyterian church in Ireland, there may have been a few people that snuck out the door, but basically it was a long line of people waiting to get out of the church. waiting to say goodbye to the minister. And everyone was polite. They knew there was a long line behind him, so they would say, "Thank you, Pastor, and wonderful service. We'll see you next week, or we'll do something else this week." But one man came to the minister in that line, and he stopped and said, "You know, Pastor, I listened to your sermon. It was very well done, and it got me thinking about miracles. But I still don't quite understand what a miracle is." So the Presbyterian minister, who's getting perturbed because he thought he got through to everybody, and he knew there was a long line of people waiting to get out of the church. So he said to the man, "Well, I will demonstrate for you. I will show you right now what a miracle is." And he told the man to turn around, face the other way. And so the man did. He turned around with his back towards the minister, looking away. And the minister just reared back and gave the man a kick in the ass. I mean, the minister really laid back, and he gave the strongest kick that he could, right in the rear end of the man who was in line. Now the man let out a yell. He screamed. He goes, "Damn, that hurt." And he turned around to face the minister. "That really, really hurt." And the minister said to him, "Well, I thought it would hurt. And in fact, if it did not, that would have been a miracle." And that probably is the best explanation of a miracle I've ever heard. A miracle is something that happens that you don't expect. It explains the inexplicable. If you don't understand what happened or what didn't happen, and it doesn't fit in anything of your known realm of possibilities, then you can chuck it up as a miracle. And I'm sure for 1,000 years, when people were cured by the dirt in Bow, they attributed it to a miracle. It was something religious, something spiritual. And it wasn't till the 21st century, some brilliant scientists in the 21st century, to figure out what it was in that dirt that in fact caused it to be a cure for so many ailments. Now, I left the podcast last week telling you that I wanted to tell you another story, then I ran out of time. So I thought I'd tell you that story today. And it takes place in the mid-19th century, the years after the Great Famine, the Great Hunger, which caused so many people, well over 1 million people, to die from starvation or starvation-related diseases. It caused well over 1 million people to leave Ireland, bound for North America and other parts of the world. And the poverty, the immense poverty and degradation in Ireland continued for many, many years after that, for decades. We don't talk about that much, and historians don't focus on that much, because as bad as things were, there were simply less Irish in Ireland to suffer during those years. So many people had died or left from the Great Hunger. But our story is about a woman who did survive that era, and she lived in a one-room hut. She still leased it from a landlord. It was a very small hut and a very small parcel of land that she leased. She grew a few potatoes. She grew a few greens in a garden, and that's what she lived on during those years. But everybody in her family had died. She lived totally alone, just living on what she could grow in that little plot of land. Now, she did have one animal. She had a pig, and she shared her food with the pig. And in fact, there were days when she went without eating so that she could feed the pig. Now, why, you might ask, would someone feed her pig and not feed herself? And the answer is that the pig was her rent. She had to pay rent every year, and she certainly didn't have any money to pay rent. And the pig was her rent. She did this for several years in a row. She would raise a pig from a piglet, fatten it up the best she could, and on a day the rent was due, which was usually called Gale Day, she would lead the pig to the home of her landlord or the landlord's agent and deliver the pig. And if the pig was fat enough, that would be her rent, and she could stay at her home for another year. And if the pig was fat enough, the landlord or the agent would typically give her a small piglet to fatten up for the next year, because she didn't have money to buy another piglet. So she would return a large pig as rent, get back a piglet, and fatten it up during the year for her next year's rent. Now she grew older and more feeble. It became more and more difficult for her to grow or tend to her garden or grow her potatoes. And it became harder and harder to feed the pig. And in fact, the blight that had devastated Ireland during the late 1840s came back and destroyed her potato crop, and she had virtually nothing to eat, and certainly nothing to feed her pig. Now, when Gale Day roamed around, she still didn't have the energy to go to her landlord at that point, but her landlord's agent came to her house and demanded payment of rent. And she pointed to her pig and said, "This is my rent. You can have my pig." And the pig at this time was extremely scrawny. There wasn't much to it. It certainly wasn't as fat as you'd expect from a pig. Couldn't get a lot of bacon out of this pig. But the agent took the pig and said, "This will do for now, but you must now leave. I'll send a bailiff to evict you from your premises within a week or two, because this will not do. This is not sufficient rent to pay with a scrawny pig." And sure enough, within a fortnight, the bailiff arose to the house, brought a crew with him. The bailiff forced her out of the house. She didn't have much belongings. The eviction process was pretty easy because she's long since pawned everything she owned to try to buy food. And then the crew tore down the hut so that she could not move back into it. Totally, it's called tumbling in the era. The whole house was tumbled, and she was dispossessed. Now, what was she going to do? She began to wonder. I don't know what I was going to do, she says to herself. There's no place for me to go. I don't have a family. And she decided she better just try to go into the nearest village and see if she could get some help. So she walked to the nearest village, and it was only a mile or so away, but in her feeble condition, it must have felt like 10, 20 miles, because it just took every ounce of energy she had to get to town. And when she got to the village, she stopped at the first house she saw. She knocked on the door, and a woman answered the door, opened the door, and the old woman said, "Please, kind lady, I have not eaten for days. Could you spare just a morsel of bread so that I could get by until tomorrow?" And the lady at the door said no, and then slammed the door shut. So the elderly woman went to the next house, and this time a man answered. She said the same thing. "Kind sir, could you spare just a little bit of food? I haven't eaten for days, and I really need a little bit to eat so that I can continue to survive." And the man said no, and he slammed the door shut. Now she continued door to door, kind of working her way into the center of the village, and everywhere she went, she got the same answer. People slammed the door and said no. And when she got to the village square, she began to ask people who were walking. There's far more pedestrians at the village square, and she stopped a pedestrian and say, "Excuse me, could you spare a shilling or just a little bit of bread, anything so that I could survive, because I haven't eaten for days and days." And everyone said no and continued walking. And she had also noticed, she was on one side of the street, she noticed as people were approaching her on her side of the street, they would walk across the street and walk on the other side, just to avoid her, just to avoid eye contact. They could say no, they could think no, but not have to say no to her face. And after trying and trying and trying to get somebody to help her, she finally just sat down on the ground and began to cry. Because she did not know what it is she could do to survive at that point. Now, as she was sitting down, she heard the sound of a horse. And it sounded like a large horse. And she looked up, and sure enough, there was a very large horse with a very large man on its back coming down the street towards her. The man was wearing a cape, and it was a huge cape, and not only covered his back, covered all the way back to cover the rear of the horse. Covered most of the tail of the horse. Huge cape. As the man rode to the center of town, people began to come out of their homes, come out of their shops, and approach him. And people were carrying a pot of stew or a loaf of freshly baked bread. And they said, please come over to our house. You're welcome to stay with us. If you stay with us, I have this pot of stew, or I have this loaf of bread, or a freshly baked pie, which you can have if you stay with us. And these were the same people who had said no to the elderly woman just moments before. And it puzzled her that they were so eager to have him over to their house, but so they shunned her so fearlessly and shamelessly, actually. So she got up and walked up to the man on horse, who was still on horseback. And she kind of tugged at his cape, and she looked up at him and said, "Sir, are you a king?" He looked down at her and says, "No, I am not a king." And then she tugged some more and asked him, "Sir, why is it that people offer food and shelter for you and offer nothing to me?" He looked down at her and he says, "Well, everybody wants me to come to their homes." And she said, "Well, what is your name?" He looked down at her and he said, "My name is Story. And you see, everybody loves a good story." And she said, but they don't want anything from me and won't offer me anything." And he looked down at her and says, "Well, kind lady, what is your name?" He looked up at her and he said, "My name is Truth." And the man on horseback looked down at her and said, "Well, there's your problem, kind lady. Nobody wants to hear the truth." So then he made an offer to her. He said, "You know what? Why don't you come with me? Come on the back of my horse, underneath the cape, and together, you and I will travel the countryside. We'll travel all through Ireland. We'll travel all around the world. And wherever we go, people will give us shelter. People will give us food. And we'll be partners in this escapade across the world." And she said, "Sure." And he reached down and grabbed her with one hand, picked her up, and put her behind his back on the horse, covered her with the cape. And then that's what they did. They spent the rest of their days traveling through Ireland, at times traveling around the world, and wherever they went, they told stories. People gave them food. People gave them shelter. And the woman survived which didn't survive before. Couldn't have survived otherwise. And that is why, even to this day, in every story, there is a little bit of truth. And that's the story I wanted to wrap up last week. Last week's story actually was a true story. And I get accused a lot of not telling true stories. People doubt me when I tell a story. It's because I tell a lot of stories which are not true. And I'm accused of being full of blarney, or worse. But I do tell true stories. But keep in mind that when I tell a not-so-true story, that in that story there still is a little bit of truth. So I'm going to wrap it up. I've got plans for next week, which I'm going to tell already, so I may even pre-record that. But in the meantime, please take a look at my website, clandonald.net. Send me an email if you got any questions or comments or suggestions or requests. It's at clandonald at gmail.com. Like and like and share me on Facebook. And I'm not on TikTok or any of those others. I don't even know what TikTok is, although it's in the news every day. Someday maybe I'll get on TikTok. If someone can tell me what it is first. Actually, send me an email. Tell me what TikTok is. But in the meantime, be safe. Be smart. Do the right thing. And goodbye.